StatSeeker allows the users to authenticate via a range of methods including LDAP, Secure LDAP, Radius, and SAML. Integrating your StatSeeker server with an existing SAML Single-Sign-On service requires you to tailor the configuration to suit your SAML deployment. So in this video, we're going to look at some example SAML user authentication integrations. Let's look at a OneLogin integration. In this instance, I've got my StatSeeker users configured on both sides. You can see I have Jack Burton here in OneLogin, and in StatSeeker, add and edit users, we have Jack set up and ready to go. So from the admin tool, I head to StatSeeker administration, user authentication. You can see the server is currently using the default file authentication, so edit mode and switch to SAML. Now, I'll be bouncing between the user authentication page in StatSeeker and the OneLogin admin console, copying values from one to the other, so I have OneLogin open in another tab. From here, I head to Applications and add a new application, search for SAML, and I'm after the Shibboleth SAML custom connector. I'll give it a name and hit save. You can add icons to help identify the integration, but I'm just going to look at getting it up and running. So, configuration. The first item is the login URL. From back in my StatSeeker panel, I want the local entity ID. For the ACS URL, I want my server, shibboleth.sso/SAML2/post. Now this string's in the documentation under StatSeeker administration, user authentication. There's example configurations for a number of single sign-on service providers there. These values are case sensitive. You want them as we see here, as they're presented in the documentation. Provide the same value for recipient and ACS validator, and copy the login URL to audience. I'll select parameters and set UID to username. Back in StatSeeker, the UID we see here is referencing the UID value to match against the StatSeeker user account. From SSO, I copy the issuer URL and drop that into our StatSeeker configuration as the remote entity ID. And back in OneLogin, I'll save the configuration. Head back to More Actions and download the SAML metadata. And back in StatSeeker, we upload that file as the ID provider metadata and save the StatSeeker configuration. Now that I have a SAML authentication configuration saved, I can update my user configurations to authenticate via SAML. Back in OneLogin, I update my user to provide access to the StatSeeker application that we've just configured and confirm that the UID value matches the username in StatSeeker. If you're setting up the OneLogin side first, then just take note of the UID value and use that when you create your user accounts in StatSeeker. Because my StatSeeker user already existed, I'm going to update the value in OneLogin to match and then save the change. I've already got an active OneLogin session as the admin account, so I'm going to open another browser, select Sign in with SAML, and log into OneLogin as Jack Burton. OneLogin then processes the user authentication with StatSeeker, and Jack is logged in. And that's SAML authentication via OneLogin for StatSeeker. Let's look at an integration with Auth0. Now, I'll be moving between the StatSeeker and Auth0 configurations quite a bit, copying values from one to the other, so I have them open in a couple of tabs. I already have some users configured on both sides. In Auth0, I have Jack Burton and a corresponding user in StatSeeker. Let's get started. I head to Applications and create a new application, give it a name, and select Regular Web Application. In Settings, scroll down to the Application URIs. The application login we can get from StatSeeker. I head to the Admin tool, StatSeeker Administration, User Authentication. We're currently using the default file authentication, so I hit Edit and switch to SAML. I'll copy the local entity ID and drop that back into our application login. For the callback URL, I need my server, shibboleth.sso/saml2/post. This string is in the documentation under Stat Secret Administration, User Authentication, and there's example configurations for a number of single sign-on service providers. Now these values are case sensitive. You want them as we see here, as they're presented in the documentation as well. Save my changes. And select Add-ons, SAML2 Web App. From the Usage tab, copy the issuer and drop that back into the remote entity ID in the StatSeeker configuration. And then back in Auth0, I download the ID provider metadata. And in StatSeeker, upload that file. Return to Auth0. From our SAML app add-on, select the Settings tab and hit Debug. I'll log in as our user, Jack Burton. Now, we search the response for our user's name as it's displayed in the StatSeeker user account. And we want to copy the name of the attribute containing that value. In this case, it's the nickname. And I'll drop that value into our StatSeeker configuration as the user ID OID. This is what StatSeeker will use to match against the StatSeeker user accounts. And now I can save the configuration. And finally, I'll update my user account in StatSeeker to use SAML Authentication. I've already got an active Auth0 session as the account admin, so I'll just open another browser, select Sign in with SAML, and log into Auth0 as Jack. Auth0 then processes the user authentication with StatSeeker, and we're logged into StatSeeker as Jack. And that completes a SAML single sign-on configuration between StatSeeker and Auth0.